The notes of the call reflect a conversation far more damning than I or many others had imagined. What those notes reflect is a classic mafia-like shakedown of a foreign leader.
That's House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff today, sure sounding like somebody who thinks the president both broke the law and ought to be impeached. Oddly enough, the top Republican in the Senate does not agree, shockingly.
That House Democrats have been indulging their impeachment obsession for nearly 3 years now. A never-ending impeachment parade in search of a rationale. In the meantime, while our friends across the Capitol rush to judgment and dive deeper into their nearly 3-year-old impeachment addiction, we'll stay focused on the American people's business.
But ABC News chief legal analyst says the memo of the phone call, that looks pretty damning to him.
When you're talking about trying to get information about your potential 2020 rival, you're now crossing into the potential legal issues, right? You're now talking about the possibility of influencing an election. And that's different than just looking back.
So for more on that, let's bring in Joe Marino. Joe, a former federal prosecutor, and he's joining us live from D.C. Joe, let's get into that. Where do you see potentially, and again, there's a lot of the unknowns, I grant you, but let's assume there's even more. With the whistleblower, there's more, the redacted information, that there's more to it for conversation. Where are the legal issues? Forget about the political consequences. Legally, could there be some exposure? And maybe not just even for the president, but for the cast of characters like Rudy Giuliani or even the various secretaries that were mentioned, even the Attorney General.
Richard, great to be with you. And I got to say, I love the fact that you led in with the statement that this is a constitutional confrontation. It's not a crisis just yet. I think it's absolutely right. So far, things are working the way they're supposed to work, right? Congress is asking for information, they're getting it, and they're digesting it. And let's see what happens. So thankfully, it's a good spot right now. Hopefully we don't get to a crisis. As far as the legal issues go, I mean, you hit a lot of them, right? Is the president soliciting something of value that would benefit him in next year's campaign, right? That's ultimately the issue. Whether there was a quid pro quo, of course that's important. But really it's just the fact that he's asking for help from a foreign leader, putting aside how inappropriate it looks and how unseemly it is that something of value that he is getting, he is soliciting from a foreign leader, and that itself is illegal. Full stop. You don't have to go much further than that. And my fear is if you do, and we go down some of these rabbit holes, we're going to wind up in the same situation with the Russia case where it takes months or even years to get to the bottom of this. You know,
let's pretend it's not the president, Joe. This idea that in a case, let's say you'd be prosecuting, you don't need the quid pro quo to be so overt. Either you give me dirt on Hunter Biden or I'm going to not give you funds. It's implied most of the time here. The president seems to think that he had to make a direct threat, otherwise nothing to see here.
Right. Well, look, that's going to be the best argument that the White House has, right? We're clearly seeing their strategy, right? Sometimes when you're on the defense, you pull back, you circle the wagons, you give minimal information. That's not what President Trump is doing. He is leaning full in. He is saying, here's the transcript. I'm going to give you the whistleblower complaint. I've done nothing wrong. And in fact, I'm going on the attack. So he's going to say there's no explicit quid pro quo here, nothing to see, let's move on. And that's why I think it would be a mistake to hyper-focus on the quid pro quo portion of this, because I don't think you need it. You don't need it for a criminal case, if there was one as a possibility, but you don't need it for impeachment, right? Just the solicitation of something of value, that is sufficient. Whether or not you try to tie it with the withholding of military aid to the Ukraine, it makes it worse. It should definitely be looked into, but it should not be a rabbit hole that distracts us from the crux of this case.
And to that point, and I'm going to talk to strategists and also talk to Liz Holtzman shortly about the differences, between Watergate and now and some of the similarities. But Joe, in keeping it to a narrow lane like you suggest, and you don't go down these rabbit holes, there's 6 committees that are going to be involved. We already know this much. Talk to me about how you'd like to see the lane defined. Is it just the phone call and the correspondence over Ukraine, including the Giuliani visits, et cetera? Or is there certain testimony you'd want related to other things that fits under this auspices of extortion or, basically, using the office to try and enrich oneself?
Well, the good news here is that it's a relatively straightforward set of facts, right? We don't need to spend years looking into this and talking to dozens of people. Let's hear from the whistleblower. Let's hear from he or she. And in fact, like you pointed out earlier, the complaint is already in the hands of certain members of Congress just a few blocks from where I'm sitting here. So let's get a sense of what triggered the concern in the first place. Let's hear from the Inspector General of the intelligence community as to why he thought this was a credible concern and why he thought it was necessary to elevate it to congressional activity. And then really, though, at that point, let's digest what happened. I mean, we know what the transcript says. We know what the law says. And so let's focus on whether or not we think this is tolerable as a society of having our president solicit information from a foreign leader.
So many people, myself among them, but I know a lot of reviewers, were so frustrated by subpoenas that were issued and never adhered to, cooperation, obstruction really being the rule of the day. Joe, this time around, will we hear from the relevant players? Do you think that there's an impossibility for people just to avoid answering questions given what's already out there and what the president's already admitted?
I don't think we're going to see that too much, thankfully. I mean, I think it sounds like the whistleblower wants to come forward. We're hearing from that person's lawyer that that person is ready and eager to go before Congress. So I think it's just a matter of time before that happens. There are some logistical hurdles that the executive branch can put in place there in terms of classification. But at the end of the day, if the person is determined and Congress wants to hear that testimony, it will be heard. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to hold back the facts here because it's not that complicated a set of facts and there are not that many people involved. And the president, I guess to his credit, seems fully willing to kind of throw the facts out there. And I'm not sure he appreciates the how important, how significant it is, this information that he's throwing out in the public domain, but it is significant.
What is the worst fear that hasn't come to light that you believe the president ought to be concerned about, given that there were many parties involved in these conversations, apparently, and obviously even the Inspector General thought that this was of grave and vital concern and timely concern? What part of this story are you most interested in learning? And we don't know if it's going to come out, but what do you think we may hear that will even add another layer of severity to it?
Well, people understand basic activity, right? I mean, so it's one thing if you try to obstruct, if you try to cloud what happened, but the American people understand the basics of what happened here. And the real question is, I think the president probably doesn't appreciate the magnitude of what he's done, but the idea of taking someone, and Joe Biden is a well-thought-of individual, I mean, generally on both sides of the political spectrum, and to sort of throw his name out there to a foreign president and say, give me dirt on that person, whether or not it was strong-armed out of the Ukrainian president or not, I think that's going to elicit a pretty visceral response from the American people in ways that perhaps a lot of the conduct underlying the Mueller probe did not. I think people got really lost in the details there. This is pretty understandable. So I think the president might not really understand the significance of the information he's put out there now in the public domain. I think his biggest concern is when people process this and say, wait a minute, this is really too far. This is not what we expect of our chief executive. I think it's the blowback he gets, which is going to empower Democrats in Congress to move forward, which perhaps they were not ready to do a couple of months ago following the Mueller testimony.
Joe, I have a feeling we're going to talk a lot more about this in the coming weeks and days. I always appreciate the time, my friend. Thank you very much. All right, everybody, when we come back, a whole lot of Democrats, they've been wanting to impeach this president for a long time, as you know, but this woman did not. So what prompted Nancy Pelosi to launch a formal inquiry, and should public opinion matter to the Dems? The historical context from Watergate veteran Liz Holtzman. She joins us next.